The call from Elliot came just after dusk, his deep voice cutting through the static of the phone line. His tone carried that familiar mix of intrigue and urgency I'd grown to recognize. When he mentioned Louisiana, I half expected it to be another one of his folklore-tinged adventures. But when he spoke the words plantation house and hollow-eyed woman, a chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the evening breeze wafting through my apartment window. By the time I arrived at his office, Elliot was already hunched over his cluttered desk, papers and books sprawled everywhere. A faint haze of cigarette smoke hung in the air, the amber glow of his desk lamp casting long shadows that danced on the walls. The scent of aged paper and ink mixed with the sharp tang of his tobacco. He barely looked up as I entered, motioning for me to take a seat. "Louisiana," he said again, sliding a faded photograph across the desk toward me. The image was grainy and black and white, but it was unmistakable. A sprawling plantation house, its grandiosity tempered by the decay that had crept over it through the decades. The windows, like empty sockets, stared out into the world with an almost malevolent emptiness. "What's the story?" I asked, leaning closer to study the photo. The edges were frayed, as though it had been handled too many times. Elliot stubbed out his cigarette and sat back, his sharp eyes glinting with the excitement that always accompanied the start of a new case. Developers are trying to build on the land, but something or someone is scaring the workers off. They're calling it the hollow-eyed woman. Local legend says she's been haunting the place since the 1800s. The developers want it dealt with. Quietly, I sighed, rubbing my temples. "And by dealt with, they mean," he grinned, "they want me to find out if it's real, and if it is, to make it not real." I couldn't help but chuckle despite myself. "You make it sound so simple." "It rarely is," he admitted, standing and grabbing his coat. "Which is why I need you. You're better at the historical side of things. I'm sure this hollow-eyed woman has a story, and I need you to help me find it." The drive south was uneventful, though the landscape began to shift as we neared our destination. The air grew heavier, laden with the scent of damp earth and the faint sweetness of decaying vegetation. Spanish moss draped from the gnarled branches of ancient oaks like the frayed remnants of ghostly shrouds. Even in daylight, the surroundings carried an oppressive weight, as though the land itself remembered things it would rather forget. When we finally arrived at the plantation, I felt an involuntary shiver despite the warm, humid air. The house loomed before us, its once pristine facade now cracked and weathered by time. Ivy crept up the walls, as though nature itself sought to reclaim the structure. The windows were dark, their glass long since shattered, and the front door hung slightly ajar, creaking with each faint gust of wind. Elliot stepped out of the car, his movements brisk and purposeful. I lingered for a moment, taking in the scene. There was something profoundly unsettling about the house, as though it exhaled an aura of misery that was palpable even from a distance. "Come on, Miguel," Elliot called, snapping me out of my reverie. "We don't have all day." I grabbed my bag and followed him up the overgrown path to the front door. As we stepped onto the sagging porch, the boards groaned beneath our weight, a mournful sound that set my nerves on edge. Elliot pushed the door open fully, the rusted hinges protesting loudly. The air inside was stifling, carrying the scent of mildew and something else, something metallic and sour that I couldn't quite place. The interior was a tableau of abandonment. Furniture lay overturned, and what little decor remained was coated in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. Faded wallpaper peeled away from the walls, revealing dark stains beneath. Elliot's flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating details I'd rather not have seen. Deep scratches on the floorboards, as though some wild animal had been trapped here. A cracked mirror hanging crookedly on the wall, its surface so tarnished it barely reflected anything. "This place has seen better days," I muttered, trying to lighten the mood. Elliot didn't respond, his focus already on the task at hand. We began our exploration methodically, room by room. The house was eerily silent, the kind of silence that felt alive, as though it were waiting for something. In the dining room, we found a long table, its surface marred by burns and deep gouges. A single chair sat at the head, its upholstery torn and stuffing spilling out like entrails. Elliot knelt beside the table, examining the markings with his magnifying glass. "These aren't random," he murmured. "Looks like someone tried to carve symbols into the wood." I leaned closer, my flashlight illuminating the faint etchings. They were crude, almost desperate, but they followed a pattern I couldn't quite decipher. "Voodoo," I suggested, "or some kind of ritual?" "Possibly," he said, standing and brushing the dust off his hands. "We'll need to do more research." As we moved deeper into the house, the oppressive atmosphere seemed to intensify. The air grew colder, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often than I cared to admit. At one point, I thought I heard a faint whisper, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. Elliot, as always, remained calm, his sharp mind taking in every detail. In the library, he found an old ledger, its pages yellowed and brittle. He flipped through it carefully, his brow furrowed in concentration. "This belonged to the original owner," he said. "Looks like a record of transactions." He paused, his jaw tightening. "Mostly slave purchases." I felt a wave of nausea, the reality of the house's dark history settling over me like a suffocating blanket. It wasn't just the supernatural that haunted this place. It was the weight of human suffering, etched into its very walls. We were about to leave the library when Elliot froze, his flashlight beam fixed on a corner of the room. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice low. "See what?" I asked, my heart racing. He pointed to a spot near the bookshelf. "A shadow. It moved." I turned my flashlight in the same direction, but the corner was empty. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Whether or not Elliot had truly seen something, it was clear that we were not alone in this house. By the time we finished our initial survey, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the house was plunged into near total darkness. We set up our equipment in the living room, the only space that felt remotely safe. As I watched Elliot meticulously organize his tools, I couldn't help but wonder what we had gotten ourselves into. The hollow-eyed woman. The name echoed in my mind, carrying with it the weight of countless ghost stories and whispered legends. As much as I tried to rationalize our situation, a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. The heavy night enveloped the plantation like a suffocating cloak as Elliot and I ventured deeper into the house. The evening had draped itself in silence, broken only by the faint hum of cicadas outside. Inside, it was as though the air held its breath. My flashlight beam swept the room cautiously, its feeble light barely piercing the gloom. Despite Elliot's calm, I couldn't shake the uneasy sensation gnawing at my gut. "Keep an eye out for anything unusual," Elliot murmured, crouching by a toppled shelf in what I assumed was once the parlor. Dust motes danced erratically in the light as he rummaged through a pile of debris. "Unusual," I scoffed quietly, gesturing at the derelict grandeur around us. That ship sailed the moment we walked in. He cast me a sidelong glance, a faint smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth before vanishing. That fleeting moment of humor was comforting in its familiarity, but it did little to lift the oppressive weight bearing down on me. The house had that effect. It demanded your attention, your unease like a predator stalking just out of sight. The parlor, once a place of social revelry, was now a sad tomb. An elaborate, but ruined, settee leaned on 3 legs against the wall, its upholstery eaten away by decades of rot. A gilded mirror hung askew, its glass cracked into a web of jagged lines. As I passed it, the distorted reflection it offered seemed almost wrong. Not malicious or overtly threatening, but enough to make my heart skip. I hurried past it, my hand tightening around the flashlight. Elliot stood, brushing off his hands, and motioned toward a doorway partially obscured by torn drapery. Without a word, we moved on. The hallway beyond was narrower, hemmed in by peeling wallpaper that seemed to claw at the edges of the light. The floors beneath creaked loudly, protesting each step as though the house itself resented our intrusion. At least that's how it felt. It wasn't just the sounds or the smell of mildew clinging to the air. It was the pressure, the way the atmosphere pushed against you, reminding you with every breath that you were unwelcome. As we edged forward, I caught sight of faded portraits mounted along the walls. Noble figures, or at least they fancied themselves as such, stared down from their frames with expressions of imperious disdain. Most of the paintings were ruined, their colors washed out and frames corroded by time. But one remained eerily vivid, an austere woman in a high-necked gown, her cold eyes seeming to follow me as I moved. "Elliot, tell me you feel that," I whispered, nodding toward the portrait. He stopped, tilted his head slightly, and regarded the painting with a critical eye. "It's a picture, Miguel." "No, not that." My voice wavered, and I hated how small it sounded. "It feels alive, almost." "Alive, or your imagination working overtime?" he asked, but his tone wasn't dismissive. If anything, I could tell he was filing the detail away as he always did. Before I could respond, the sound of something faint and rhythmic reached my ears. It was a soft tapping, like fingernails drumming against wood. My heart jumped, and I instinctively shined my flashlight down the hallway, but it revealed nothing but shadows. "Do you hear that?" I breathed. Elliot held up a hand, signaling for silence. The tapping continued, uneven and intermittent, as though whatever made the sound was hesitating, deciding. He gestured for me to follow as he cautiously moved forward, his flashlight fixed ahead like a weapon. I didn't want to follow, I wanted to turn around and bolt, but I trusted Elliot, and more importantly, I trusted his instincts. The sound led us to a door at the end of the hallway. It was cracked open, and an almost imperceptible draft seeped through the gap, carrying with it that same metallic scent I'd noticed earlier. Blood, or at least that's what it smelled like to me. Elliot placed a hand on the door and gave me a quick look, a silent question. "Are you ready?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure if the trembling in my hands had betrayed me. He pushed the door open, and we stepped into what appeared to be a study. The room was, impossibly, in better condition than any we'd seen so far. The furniture, though worn, was intact. A large oak desk dominated the space, papers and books scattered across its surface. Shelves lined the walls, filled with dusty tomes that begged to be explored, though I doubted they held anything comforting. A single chair sat before the desk, its upholstery torn but not ravaged. But what drew my attention immediately was the window at the far end of the room, or rather what stood in front of it. A figure, a woman, stood silhouetted against the faint moonlight streaming through the glass. She was tall, her frame shrouded in a tattered, dark dress, and her eyes, or what should have been her eyes, were hollow, empty voids that seemed to consume the light. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Elliot didn't move either, but I could see the muscles in his jaw tighten, his flashlight trained on her. "Who are you?" he called out, his voice steady, authoritative. The woman didn't respond. She tilted her head slightly, as though regarding us with an unseen gaze. Then, before I could so much as blink, she was gone. One moment she was there, and the next, the room was empty, the only proof of her presence being the lingering weight of her malice. "Did you see?" I began, but Elliot was already moving toward the desk, scanning the scattered papers with practiced efficiency. I joined him, though my hands still shook. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered, picking up what looked like an old ledger. The pages were yellowed, the handwriting spidery and erratic. "What is it?" I asked, peering over his shoulder. "It's a record," he said, flipping through the pages. "But it's incomplete. Names, dates, and then look at this." He pointed to a section where the handwriting abruptly changed, becoming jagged, frantic. The words weren't in English, but they carried a strange weight nonetheless, as though the paper itself resented bearing them. "What language is that?" I asked. "Hard to say," he admitted, "but it's not modern. Might be worth a closer look once we're out of here." I wanted to ask what he meant by "once we're out of here," but something about the way he said it silenced me. Instead, I let my gaze wander to the shelves, where the spines of countless books seemed to whisper promises of knowledge better left undiscovered. One title in particular caught my eye, its letters faded but still legible. The binding writes, I reached for it hesitantly, my fingers brushing the cracked leather cover, when a sudden noise made me jump. The tapping had returned, louder this time, and it was coming from just outside the study door. Elliot's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. Without a word, he motioned for me to stay behind as he approached the door. I wanted to protest, to tell him not to go alone, but the words died in my throat. Instead, I watched as he opened the door cautiously, his flashlight slicing through the darkness beyond. The hallway was empty. Still, the tapping continued, louder now, reverberating through the walls as though the house itself were alive. My grip on the book tightened, and I stepped closer to Elliot, my earlier fear replaced by something colder, determination. "We need to leave," I said quietly. Elliot glanced back at me, his expression unreadable. "Not yet." Before I could argue, the sound suddenly stopped, and with it, the oppressive weight of the air seemed to lift. For a moment, it felt as though the house had exhaled, its hunger momentarily sated. But I knew better than to trust it. "Let's keep moving," Elliot said, his tone leaving no room for debate. And so we did, stepping once more into the oppressive labyrinth of the hollow-eyed woman's domain, the echoes of her presence dogging our every step. Elliot had that look in his eyes again, a mixture of sharp focus and unnerving calm. He stood in front of the staircase that wound upward into the house's shadows, the beam of his flashlight slicing through the darkness like a scalpel. I could feel the weight of the upper floors pressing down on us, a silent warning written in the heavy air. "Upstairs," he said simply, already placing a foot on the first creaking step. "You sure about that?" I asked, keeping my voice low as though the walls themselves were listening. The ground floor isn't exactly rolling out the welcome mat. He turned to glance at me over his shoulder, the faintest smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. Would you prefer we wait for the house to come to us? Fair point, I muttered, reluctantly falling in step behind him. The stairs groaned under our combined weight, each step an accusation. What business do you have here? The upper floor was, if possible, even more foreboding than the rooms below. The hallway stretched before us, flanked by closed doors on either side. The air was thick with that familiar metallic tang, and the temperature seemed to drop with every step we took. My breath came in shallow bursts, each exhale visible in the flashlight beams like ghostly wisps. Something's been here, Elliot murmured, crouching to examine deep gouges carved into the floorboards. They ran parallel like claw marks, leading from one of the doors to the center of the hall. An animal? I asked, though even as the words left my mouth, I knew they sounded ridiculous. He shook his head. Not likely. His hand hovered over the scratches as though trying to feel the energy they'd left behind. Too precise, too deliberate. We both turned toward the door at the end of the hallway, the one where the marks originated. It stood slightly ajar, and from within came a faint, rhythmic creaking, like an old rocking chair swaying back and forth. My throat tightened. Elliot straightened and moved toward the door without hesitation, his flashlight steady in his hand. I followed, my pulse pounding in my ears. Every instinct screamed at me to stop, to turn back, but the trust one had in Elliot propelled me forward. The room beyond the door was a bedroom, or at least it had been once. Now it was a ruin. The bed frame collapsed, its mattress a nest of springs and disintegrating fabric. The walls were covered in yellowed wallpaper that peeled in long, curling strips. The creaking sound had stopped the moment we entered, and the stillness was more oppressive than any noise could have been. Elliot's flashlight landed on a writing desk pushed against the far wall. Unlike the rest of the room, it seemed relatively untouched by time. Its surface gleamed faintly in the light, and a single object rested atop it, a leather-bound book. I hung back as Elliot approached the desk. My gaze flitted nervously around the room, half expecting the shadows to leap at us. When he reached for the book, a sharp crack echoed through the room, like a whip striking the air. Both of us froze. It's just the floor settling, Elliot said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. He opened the book, its brittle pages crackling as he turned them. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the text. "What is it?" I asked, stepping closer despite the unease twisting in my gut. "A diary," he replied, "belonged to the plantation owner." "That's convenient," I muttered, though I couldn't deny the thrill of discovery that coursed through me. Whatever answers we were seeking, they were likely hidden in those pages. Elliot began to read aloud, his voice steady but grim. The entries were mundane at first, records of harvests, the weather, social events. But as he turned the pages, the tone shifted. The writing became frantic, disjointed. March 4th, 1852. The hollow-eyed woman has cursed this house. The servants whisper her name in fear, but they do not see what I see. She watches me through the walls, through the mirrors. She wants my soul, but I will not give it. I shuddered. The words felt alive, as though the emotions of their author had seeped into the ink and paper. Elliot continued flipping through the diary, his brow furrowing. March 12th, 1852. The rituals have failed. The amulet offers no protection. She grows stronger each night. The walls breathe with her hatred. I hear her in my dreams. She calls my name, but I will not answer. Elliot glanced at me, his expression unreadable. The amulet, he said, the one the developers found. You think it's connected? I asked, though I already knew the answer. He nodded, his fingers running over the faded text. It wasn't meant to summon her. It was meant to contain her. Before I could respond, the temperature in the room plummeted. My breath froze mid-exhale, the air turning icy and sharp. The flashlight in my hand flickered, its light wavering like a candle in the wind. Elliot, I began, but I didn't need to finish. He had already sensed it. The shadows in the corners of the room thickened, coalescing into a shape that made my stomach lurch. It was the woman from before, the hollow-eyed woman. She stood motionless, her void-like eyes fixed on us. Her presence filled the room, oppressive and malevolent. Elliot held his ground, his flashlight steady on her. "What do you want?" he demanded. She didn't answer. Instead, the room seemed to shudder, the very walls vibrating with her rage. The desk groaned under an invisible weight, and the diary snapped shut with a deafening bang. "Move!" Elliot barked, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the door. I stumbled after him, my flashlight clattering to the floor as the room erupted into chaos. The shadows writhed, the walls cracked, and the air was filled with an inhuman wail that made my ears ring. We burst into the hallway, slamming the door shut behind us. I leaned against the wall, gasping for breath, my heart hammering in my chest. Elliot stood beside me, his expression grim but composed. "She's angry," he said, stating the obvious. "No kidding," I snapped, though my voice was shaky. "What the hell was that?" "A warning," he replied, his gaze drifting back toward the door. "Whatever happened here, it wasn't just cruelty or tragedy. There's something darker at work." "And the diary?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. He held it up, the leather cover somehow unscathed despite the chaos we just escaped. "This is our key, but it's not enough. We need to know what happened here, and why." As we stood there, catching our breath, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching us, its unseen eyes filled with malice. The hollow-eyed woman wasn't just a ghost. She was something far worse, and she wasn't finished with us yet. The oppressive silence of the house was deafening as we moved through the hallway, the lingering chill of the encounter with the hollow-eyed woman gnawing at my nerves. My legs felt like lead, each step an act of defiance against the primal instincts screaming for me to leave. Elliot walked ahead, his flashlight steady, his posture a study in unflinching resolve. I envied that about him, his ability to focus, to compartmentalize fear as though it were a minor inconvenience. "Let's find a place to regroup," Elliot said, his voice low but firm, breaking the silence that felt like it was pressing against my skull. "I need to go through this diary." I nodded, though I wasn't sure if he even saw the gesture in the dim light. My hands were still trembling slightly, and the weight of the house's oppressive energy seemed to dig into my chest like claws. We passed closed doors that loomed in the darkness, each one feeling like it could swing open at any moment, revealing something I didn't want to see. Elliot stopped in front of one of the rooms, testing the door handle. It creaked open, revealing what appeared to be a study or sitting room. Unlike the rest of the house, this room was relatively intact, dusty and worn, but not consumed by the decay that had devoured the other spaces. A single armchair sat facing a grand, though soot-streaked, fireplace. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books whose titles had long since faded away. A small writing desk stood in the corner, a quill and ink pot resting atop it as though their owner had only just stepped away. "This will do," Elliot murmured, stepping inside and setting the diary on the desk. He turned to me, his eyes glinting in the flashlight beam. "Keep watch. Let me know if you see or feel anything." "Yeah, sure," I replied, my voice tighter than I intended. Feeling was an understatement. The house was practically breathing down my neck. Elliot sat at the desk, flipping open the diary with careful precision. The sound of the brittle pages turning was unnervingly loud in the stillness. I moved to stand by the doorway, keeping my flashlight aimed into the hallway beyond. The shadows seemed to ripple, shifting in the corners of my vision. I blinked hard, telling myself it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, but the unease coiling in my gut refused to be ignored. As Elliot read, his murmured observations filling the space, I found myself drawn to the shelves. The books, though worn, seemed to carry a weight, as though their contents still pulsed with the energy of whoever had last held them. My fingers brushed the spine of one volume, and a strange, tingling sensation shot through me. I pulled my hand back quickly, my breath hitching. "Something wrong?" Elliot asked without looking up, his voice calm but sharp. "No," I lied, shaking my head. "Just, the air feels heavier in here." "It's not just the air," he said cryptically, turning another page. His face was impassive, but I could see the gears turning behind his eyes. Whatever he was reading, it was piecing something together in his mind. I turned back to the hallway, trying to shake off the lingering sensation that I was being watched. The beam of my flashlight swept across the floor, the walls, the ceiling. For a moment, everything seemed normal, or as normal as it could be in a place like this. But then I heard it, the faintest creak of a floorboard, coming from somewhere deeper in the house. "Elliot," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Did you hear that?" He didn't respond, too engrossed in the diary. The creak came again, louder this time, and my grip on the flashlight tightened. Slowly, I stepped out into the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. The beam of light wavered slightly as my hands shook, but I forced myself to move forward. The sound seemed to come from one of the doors farther down the hall, the one we hadn't opened yet. It stood slightly ajar, the darkness beyond it impenetrable. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was just the house settling, or a stray animal that had found its way inside. But deep down, I knew better. I reached the door and hesitated, my hand hovering over the handle. My breath was shallow, my pulse thunderous in my ears. Summoning what little courage I had left, I pushed the door open. The room beyond was small, almost claustrophobic, and filled with the remnants of old furniture. A bed frame, a wardrobe, a nightstand. The air was colder here, and the metallic scent I'd noticed earlier was stronger. My flashlight swept across the room, revealing nothing out of the ordinary. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. On the nightstand lay a small, tarnished locket. Its chain was broken, and its surface was scratched, but it seemed to pulse faintly in the light. I approached it cautiously, a strange sense of unease settling over me. The moment my fingers brushed the locket, a sudden wave of dizziness washed over me. The room seemed to warp and twist, the walls bending as though they were made of liquid. I stumbled backward, clutching my head, and the locket fell to the floor with a metallic clink. The air around me grew heavy, oppressive, and I heard a whisper, soft at first, but growing louder with each passing second. It wasn't a single voice, but a cacophony, overlapping and indistinct. "Elliot!" I shouted, my voice raw with panic. Some things, before I could finish, the floor beneath me buckled. I fell hard, the breath knocked out of me as the world seemed to dissolve into darkness. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling my ears until I thought they would burst. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer in the room. I was standing in the middle of the hallway, though I couldn't remember how I'd gotten there. The door to the room I'd entered was closed, and the locket was nowhere to be seen. Elliot appeared in the doorway of the study, his expression unreadable. "What happened?" he asked, his voice steady but edged with concern. I shook my head, trying to make sense of what I'd experienced. I don't know. There was a locket, and then he placed a hand on my shoulder, grounding me. "The house is playing tricks on you," he said. "It feeds on fear. You can't let it get to you." I nodded, though my mind was still reeling. Whatever had just happened, it was more than a trick. The house wasn't just playing games, it was trying to warn me, or maybe trying to claim me. Elliot led me back into the study, closing the door firmly behind us. "We need to be careful," he said, his tone grave. "This place is more dangerous than I thought." I didn't argue. The hollow-eyed woman wasn't just a ghost. She was something far worse. And as much as I wanted to leave, I knew we had to stay. There were answers here, buried beneath layers of darkness and fear. We just had to survive long enough to find them. The study's air was thick with dust and stale energy as Elliot leaned over the desk, his fingers tracing the brittle edges of the plantation owner's diary. I sat on the armchair, my back pressed into the faded upholstery as if it could shield me from the house's pervasive chill. The flames in the fireplace flickered weakly, casting trembling shadows across the room. It was a false comfort, the warmth unable to banish the creeping cold that seemed to come not from outside, but from within the walls themselves. "Listen to this," Elliot said, his voice steady but tinged with something that made my stomach tighten. He adjusted the lantern on the desk and squinted at the faded ink. Her eyes watch me through the mirrors, through the cracks. "She waits." He paused, glancing up at me. "Sound familiar?" I nodded grimly. The hollow-eyed woman's haunting visage was impossible to forget. Every empty corridor, every flicker of movement in the shadows. It all felt like her unholy gaze drilling into my soul. Elliot continued, flipping to another entry and pointing at the swirling, erratic handwriting near the bottom of the page. "The binding rites failed. The amulet shattered. She grows stronger each night. I will not see the dawn." He sat back, tapping the desk thoughtfully. "The amulet," he said almost to himself. "It wasn't just protection. It was part of a ritual, a binding spell meant to contain her, to hold her energy at bay. And it didn't work," I added. My voice felt small in the oppressive atmosphere. "So what does that mean for us?" Elliot leaned forward, resting his chin on his folded hands. "It means two things," he said slowly. "One, the ritual was incomplete. And two," he met my eyes, "she's not bound to the house. She's the house." I let out a shaky breath, glancing around as if the walls themselves would close in on us. The idea that the hollow-eyed woman wasn't a spirit confined to certain spaces but an entity fused with the very fabric of this place was almost too much to process. "And what do we do about it?" I asked, swallowing the lump in my throat. Elliot stood abruptly, reaching for his coat. We find the rest of the ritual. If there's any chance of completing it, it'll be our only way out of here. Just like that, I muttered, following his lead. Find an ancient, incomplete spell, finish it, and hope the malevolent spirit doesn't kill us first? Sounds easy. Elliot smirked faintly. It beats the alternative. We ventured deeper into the house, the oppressive atmosphere growing heavier with each step. The faint metallic scent that had plagued us earlier was stronger now, sharper. It clawed at the back of my throat, an unspoken reminder of the horrors this place had witnessed. The hallway opened into a room unlike any we'd seen before, a space that could only be described as ritualistic. The walls were bare, the floor covered in intricate carvings that spiraled outward like veins from the center. At the room's heart stood a stone pedestal, its surface scarred with jagged marks. The remnants of candles lay scattered around, their wax hardened into misshapen pools. This was the ritual site, Elliot said, stepping cautiously into the room. His flashlight beam danced across the carvings, illuminating symbols I couldn't begin to decipher. I hesitated, the weight of the room pressing down on me like an invisible hand. And the carvings? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Elliot crouched, running his fingers along the edge of one of the symbols. Ancient, he murmured. Not voodoo, something older. I wasn't sure how he could tell, but the certainty in his tone was enough for me. He stood and approached the pedestal, his flashlight illuminating a hollow recess in its center, a place where something had once sat. The amulet, he said, his voice tight with realization. It was placed here. It was the anchor. I swallowed hard, feeling the air shift around us. The house seemed to pulse, the walls vibrating with barely restrained anger. And now it's gone, I said. So the ritual was disrupted? Elliot finished, his voice steady despite the tension creeping into his shoulders. But the carvings tell us what to do. He pulled out his notebook and began sketching the symbols, his brow furrowed in concentration. I kept my flashlight trained on the walls, half expecting them to bleed or shift before my eyes. The air grew colder, and the shadows lengthened, curling around the edges of the room like claws. I tightened my grip on the flashlight, my heart pounding in my ears. Elliot, I began, but he held up a hand, silencing me. I know, he said quietly, not looking up. She's here. The room seemed to darken further, the light from our flashlights dimming as if swallowed by the void. The carvings on the floor pulsed faintly, their glow rhythmic, almost alive. And then, from the far corner of the room, she appeared. The hollow-eyed woman was no longer a shadow or a flicker of movement. She stood fully formed, her empty eyes fixed on us. Her presence was suffocating, her aura twisting the air into something tangible and cruel. Her mouth moved, but no sound emerged, only the weight of her malice. Elliot didn't flinch. She's testing us, he said, his voice strong despite the terror in his eyes. She doesn't want us to finish what her tormentor started. What do we do? I asked, my voice breaking. Elliot turned to me, his notebook clutched tightly in his hand. We don't stop. He stepped toward the pedestal, his movements deliberate. The hollow-eyed woman shifted, her form twisting unnaturally as she moved to block his path. I froze, unsure of what to do, but Elliot didn't hesitate. He thrust his notebook toward me. The symbols, he said urgently. Copy them onto the floor. Now. I didn't question him. My hands shook as I took the notebook and crouched, using the charcoal pencil he'd given me to replicate the carvings as best I could. The symbols seemed to writhe beneath my fingers, their shapes pulsing with a life of their own. The hollow-eyed woman lunged toward Elliot, her movements jerky and inhuman. He dodged, grabbing one of the remnants of candles and throwing it toward the pedestal. The room shuddered violently, the carvings flaring with light. She screamed, a sound that was less noise and more a physical force, driving me to my knees. "Keep going," Elliot shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. I forced myself to move, my hands working frantically to complete the symbols. The house seemed to fight against us, the walls warping and the air growing heavier with each passing second. The hollow-eyed woman's rage was palpable, her form flickering between solidity and shadow as she tried to stop us. Finally, Elliot shouted, "The amulet! It's the last piece, but it's gone," I yelled, my voice raw. "Not entirely," he countered, pointing toward the carvings. "Find it. It's still here." I scrambled toward the edges of the room, my flashlight scanning desperately for anything that resembled the tarnished locket we'd seen before. The hollow-eyed woman's scream echoed again, but I ignored it, focusing on the symbols and the faint glow pulsing from the pedestal. And then, there it was, half buried beneath the debris, its chain broken but intact. I grabbed the amulet and raced back to Elliot, my heart pounding as I placed it in his outstretched hand. Elliot slammed the amulet into the pedestal, his voice rising above the chaos. "Let her rest." The room erupted in light, the carvings flaring brilliantly as the hollow-eyed woman let out one final, ear-splitting wail. The energy surged, enveloping us, and then silence. The house exhaled, its oppressive weight lifting as the hollow-eyed woman dissolved into nothingness. Elliot collapsed against the pedestal, his breath ragged. "We did it," he said, his voice barely audible. I sat beside him, clutching the broken amulet in my hands. The house was still, but the memory of its rage lingered in every corner. The hollow-eyed woman was gone, but the scars she'd left behind would never truly heal. The house was unervingly silent after the ritual, as though it were holding its breath. I could feel the tension in the air, an unspoken promise that it wasn't over. Elliot and I sat in the ritual room, both of us too drained to move for several minutes. The pedestal stood in the center, the broken amulet still faintly warm where it rested. Its once menacing glow had dimmed to an ember, but its power lingered. Elliot broke the silence first, his voice hoarse. "She's still here." I looked at him sharply, my head pounding from exhaustion and the weight of his words. "You can't be serious. That should have worked. Felt like it worked." He shook his head, his jaw tightening as he stared at the pedestal. "It wasn't enough. This was just one piece of the puzzle. Whatever bound her here, it's deeper than the ritual alone." His words chilled me more than the icy air seeping through the walls. I leaned back against the cold stone, my body aching from the adrenaline crash. "So what now?" I asked, my voice cracking under the weight of my own fear. Elliot didn't answer immediately. He stood, his movements slow but deliberate, and began pacing the perimeter of the room. His flashlight beam swept over the carvings etched into the floor, lingering on the points where the symbols seemed to converge. "She's not done with us," he said finally, his tone grim. "But maybe, just maybe, she's willing to talk." "Talk?" I repeated, incredulous. Elliot, you've seen what she's capable of. She doesn't exactly strike me as the conversational type. He paused, his gaze flickering toward the faintest shadow in the corner of the room. No, he admitted, but she's angry, and anger comes from somewhere. There's a story here, Miguel. We just don't have all of it yet. I opened my mouth to argue but stopped when I saw the look in his eyes. It was that same fierce determination that had gotten us through countless cases before, even when the odds felt insurmountable. I took a deep breath, steadying myself as I rose to my feet. Fine, I said. But if we're doing this, we need to find her terms. No more of this chasing shadows nonsense. Elliot nodded, already moving toward the door. She left us clues, he said over his shoulder. We just need to follow them. We returned to the master bedroom, the site of so much of the house's oppressive energy. The room was unchanged, as though frozen in time since our last visit. The faint metallic tang lingered in the air, but it was overshadowed now by something subtler, something that felt almost like sorrow. It was a disarming shift, one that set my nerves even more on edge. Elliot's flashlight found the broken mirror hanging crookedly on the wall. Its jagged surface fractured our reflections into grotesque shards, each one staring back with an intensity that made my stomach churn. Mirrors, he murmured, stepping closer. She's been watching through them. I stayed near the door, unwilling to approach the mirror's ominous presence. And what does that mean? It means, Elliot said, running his fingers along the frame, that this house wasn't just her prison, it was her window, her way of seeing the world she was cut off from. But it was incomplete. He stepped back, tilting his head as though trying to see the mirror from her perspective. Think about it. The amulet was part of the ritual, but it wasn't just about binding her. It was about control. Whoever performed that ritual, they wanted her trapped, yes, but they also wanted to keep her tethered, accessible. To what end? I asked, my voice quiet but sharp. Why would someone do that? Elliot turned to me, his expression unreadable. Power, fear, any number of reasons. But whoever they were, they underestimated her. And now we're cleaning up their mess. He turned his attention back to the mirror, his flashlight catching something carved into the wood of the frame. Here, he said, beckoning me over. Look at this. I hesitated but stepped closer, shining my own flashlight on the spot he indicated. There, carved deep into the wood, was a symbol, a spiral pattern that mirrored the ones we'd seen in the ritual room. It's a key, Elliot said, his voice tinged with excitement. This is part of her story, and I'd bet my life there are more of these hidden throughout the house. I stared at him, my heart sinking. You're not suggesting we... I am, he interrupted, already moving toward the door. If we're going to understand her, we need to find them all. The search was grueling. Every room we entered felt more oppressive than the last, the house's energy growing darker and more tangled the deeper we delved. But Elliot was relentless, his determination cutting through the suffocating weight like a blade. I followed, my unease mounting with every step. We found more carvings. One etched into the frame of the dining room's window, another burned into the back of a chair in the parlor, and yet another hidden beneath a layer of peeling wallpaper in the upstairs hallway. Each one carried the same spiral motif, each one pulsing faintly with an energy that made my skin crawl. What do they mean? I asked as we uncovered the fifth symbol, this one carved into the underside of an old table. Elliot didn't answer immediately. He was kneeling by the table, his fingers tracing the spiral as though trying to coax its secrets to the surface. "They're fragments," he said finally. "Pieces of a story, her story. These symbols, they're a map of her pain." I swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling over me like a shroud. "And where does the map lead?" "To the truth," he said simply, standing and brushing the dust from his hands. "If we can follow it, if we can understand her pain, maybe, just maybe, we can find a way to set her free." The thought sent a chill down my spine, but I didn't argue. As much as I hated to admit it, I knew he was right. The hollow-eyed woman wasn't just a vengeful spirit. She was something more, something shaped by agony and betrayal. And if we were ever going to escape this house, we had to confront the heart of that pain. The final symbol was in the attic, etched into the underside of a broken beam. The space was suffocatingly small, the air thick with dust and the scent of decay. I held my flashlight steady as Elliot climbed up, his movements careful but quick. The light caught the symbol as he lifted the beam, and he let out a low whistle. "This is it," he said, climbing back down with the beam in hand. "The last piece." He laid the beam on the attic floor, the symbol catching the light in a way that made it almost seem alive. "They're not just symbols," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're markers, points of focus. They bind her story together. And now that we have them all?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Elliot looked at me, his expression grim. "Now we call her." The words sent a shiver through me, but I nodded. Whatever came next, I knew there was no turning back. Together, we descended the attic steps, the weight of the house pressing down on us with every step. The hollow-eyed woman's truth awaited us, and whether we were ready for it or not, we would face it together. The house felt different as we descended from the attic, Elliot leading the way with his flashlight cutting through the thickened dark. Its beams caught dust motes drifting lazily in the stagnant air, but even with the light, the hallways seemed darker than before, thicker, more suffocating. The air crackled faintly, like static before a thunderstorm. The hollow-eyed woman had always been a presence, a shadow at the corner of the eye, but now she felt closer, tangible, waiting. "I can feel it," Elliot muttered, his voice low but certain. "She's drawing us in." "That's reassuring," I said under my breath, though the quip did little to ease the rising tension in my chest. My palms were slick against the flashlight, and I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and uneven in my ears. Whatever awaited us in the ritual room, I knew it wasn't going to let us leave easily. We reached the central staircase, its once grand banister now warped and splintering. The house creaked around us, groaning like a living thing stretching its ancient bones. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, not just by her, but by the house itself, as though every corner, every cracked floorboard, held a piece of her gaze. Elliot paused at the top of the stairs, his shoulders tense. He didn't look back as he spoke. "She's going to fight us." "I figured," I replied, swallowing hard. "She's not exactly the welcoming type." "It's going to get worse before it gets better," he continued, descending the steps with deliberate slowness. "She won't go quietly." I followed, gripping the banister as the staircase groaned under our weight. "And what if we can't stop her?" The question slipped out before I could stop it, my voice barely above a whisper. Elliot didn't answer, but his silence said enough. By the time we reached the first floor, the oppressive energy was suffocating. The walls seemed to pulse faintly, as though the house were alive and breathing around us. The metallic tang was back, stronger than ever, coating my tongue and making my stomach churn. Elliot led the way to the ritual room, his footsteps steady even as the atmosphere grew heavier with each step. The room was exactly as we'd left it, yet entirely different. The carvings on the floor seemed to writhe in the dim light, their edges glowing faintly as though alive. The air was dense, charged with a malevolence that pressed against my skin, my lungs, my thoughts. The pedestal at the center of the room stood like a sentinel, its surface still bearing the faint imprint of the amulet. "She's here," Elliot said, his voice low and steady. I nodded, though the motion felt futile. Of course she was here. She had never left. She had been waiting for this moment, her presence coiled and ready to strike. Elliot knelt beside the pedestal, his flashlight placed carefully on the ground to illuminate the carvings. He reached into his satchel, pulling out the sketches of the symbols we'd collected and laying them out in a semicircle. "We need to complete the map," he said, more to himself than to me. "The symbols are her story, but we're missing the final piece." I knelt beside him, my hands trembling as I helped arrange the papers. The spirals seemed to pulse faintly, their energy humming through my fingertips. As we worked, the temperature in the room plummeted, and my breath came out in visible puffs of air. "You think she's going to give us that final piece?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Elliot didn't look up. Not willingly. The air shifted then, heavy and electric, and the room plunged into silence. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was a vacuum, a void that swallowed everything. My flashlight flickered, its beam weak and sputtering as the shadows around us thickened. And then she appeared. She didn't drift or glide this time. She emerged, pulled into existence as though the very fabric of reality had been torn open to let her through. The hollow-eyed woman stood at the edge of the room, her form flickering like a dying flame. Her eyes, those hollow, empty voids, were fixed on us, unblinking and relentless. Her presence was a weight that pressed down on my chest, stealing my breath and rooting me to the spot. Elliot rose slowly, his hands at his sides, his posture calm but deliberate. "We're not here to harm you," he said, his voice steady despite the overwhelming pressure in the room. "We're here to understand." Her head tilted slightly, the movement unnatural, jerky, as though she were a puppet whose strings had been yanked. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Still, I felt it, the wave of raw emotion, of fury and grief and despair, that washed over me in her silent scream. Elliot didn't flinch. "You've been wronged," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "We know that. We've seen the pieces of your story, but we need to know the rest. We need to know why." The temperature dropped further, and frost began to creep along the edges of the room, spiderwebbing across the walls and floor. The symbols carved into the stone flared brighter, their glow pulsing in time with the heavy thrum in my chest. "You think she's going to just tell us?" I asked, my voice cracking. "She's been haunting this place for over a century. She's not exactly chatty." Elliot ignored me, his focus entirely on her. "We're not your enemy," he said, taking a single step forward. "We're here to listen." She moved then, her form blurring as though it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. One moment she was a solid, imposing figure. The next she was smoke and shadow barely there. Her presence was unbearable, a suffocating weight that pressed down on every inch of me. And then, without warning, she lunged. The force of her presence slammed into me like a tidal wave, knocking me backward and sending the flashlight skittering across the floor. The room spun, the walls bending and twisting as though the house itself were coming apart. I heard Elliot shout something, but his voice was distant, drowned out by the deafening roar in my ears. When I opened my eyes, I wasn't in the ritual room anymore. I was standing in the middle of a field, the tall grass swaying gently in the breeze. The sun hung low in the sky, casting the landscape in a warm, golden glow. It was beautiful but wrong. I knew this wasn't real. The air was too still, the colors too vivid. It was a memory, her memory. A figure stood in the distance, her back to me. She was tall, her posture proud, her dark hair cascading down her back. She didn't turn, but I knew it was her, the hollow-eyed woman. And then the scene shifted. The field was gone, replaced by the plantation house. But it was whole again, its walls pristine and its windows gleaming in the sunlight. Laughter echoed from within, the sound of children playing blending with the faint hum of a piano. It was a house full of life, full of joy. But the joy was fleeting. The laughter turned to screams, and the warmth of the sunlight was replaced by the harsh glow of fire. The walls burned, the flames consuming everything in their path. And through it all, she stood at the center, her eyes hollow and empty, her face a mask of anguish. I heard her voice then, not a whisper, but a wail, raw and guttural. "They took everything," she cried, her words cutting through the roar of the fire. "They left me with nothing." The vision dissolved, and I was back in the ritual room, gasping for breath. Elliot was at my side, his hands gripping my shoulders, his face pale but determined. "What happened?" he asked urgently. I looked at him, my chest heaving as I tried to steady myself. "Her story," I managed. She showed me her story. Elliot's grip tightened. "Then we have what we need." The hollow-eyed woman was still there, her form flickering and unstable, but her rage had lessened. She watched us, her hollow eyes filled not with malice, but with sorrow. Elliot knelt by the pedestal, his hands moving quickly as he rearranged the symbols. "We finished the ritual," he said, his voice resolute. "We give her what she's been denied." As he worked, I felt the weight in the room begin to lift, the oppressive energy giving way to something softer. The symbols flared once more, their light filling the room as Elliot placed the broken amulet in the center. "She deserves peace," he said, his voice barely audible over the hum of energy. "And so does this house." The light grew brighter, blinding, and the hollow-eyed woman let out one final piercing cry, a sound that was equal parts anguish and relief. And then she was gone. The blinding light consumed the room in its entirety, leaving no corner untouched. It bore into my eyes, even through the shield of my raised hand, until it swallowed every shadow, every trace of the house's malice. For an instant, the oppressive presence that had haunted us, the relentless weight of her sorrow and anger vanished. And then silence, the kind of silence that deafened, cutting through the air like a scalpel. I opened my eyes hesitantly, blinking spots from my vision. The light was gone, leaving behind a stillness I wasn't sure I trusted. Elliot was slumped against the pedestal, his face pale but resolute, his breathing shallow as he clutched the remains of the amulet in his hand. "Elliot," I asked tentatively, my voice barely above a whisper. The weight of the room still lingered in my chest, coiled like a snake ready to strike. "Are you okay?" He nodded, though the movement seemed to cost him. "She's gone," he murmured. "At least For now. I wanted to believe him, but the house still felt alive. Its walls too close, its air too cold. The oppressive energy had lessened, yes, but it hadn't disappeared entirely. I reached out to help him up, my hands trembling from exhaustion. He took my arm, leaning heavily on me as we stumbled out of the ritual room. The hallway felt impossibly long, the shadows still clinging to the edges like cobwebs. My flashlight, miraculously still functioning, cast an unsteady beam ahead of us. Each step we took echoed unnaturally, the sound bouncing back at us as though the house itself was reluctant to let us go. "Do you feel that?" I asked, glancing over at Elliot. He was focused, his brow furrowed in thought, but he nodded. "She's not completely gone," he said, his voice rough. "The house, it still holds pieces of her. Fragments." "Great," I muttered, more to myself than to him. "So we're not done." Elliot didn't respond, but his silence spoke volumes. We finally reached the staircase, its banister warped and splintered, just as before. The creaking steps groaned under our weight as we descended, each sound sharper in the absence of her wailing presence. My grip on Elliot tightened as he stumbled slightly, his exhaustion finally catching up to him. "You need to rest," I said, glancing at him with concern. "We both do." He shook his head. "Not yet. There's still something here. We need to figure out what it is." I wanted to argue, to insist that we'd done enough for one night, but the determination in his eyes silenced me. This was Elliot. He didn't stop until the job was done, no matter what it cost him. I just hoped the cost this time wouldn't be more than we could bear. We made our way to the parlor, the room that had seemed almost untouched compared to the rest of the house. Now, though it felt different, the air was heavier, the faint metallic tang lingering like an uninvited guest. I eased Elliot into the armchair by the fireplace, his exhaustion evident in the way he sank into it. The fireplace itself was dark, its soot-streaked bricks cold and unwelcoming. I stared at it for a moment, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't quite untangle. The house had shown us so much. Its cruelty, its pain, its lingering rage, but it still felt like we were missing something, some vital piece of the puzzle. Elliot broke the silence, his voice low but steady. "The memories she showed you, you said they were of her life, her suffering." I nodded, the images flashing in my mind like fragments of a nightmare. "She lost everything," I said, my throat tightening. "Her family, her home. She was betrayed, burned, left with nothing." "And the ritual?" he asked, leaning forward slightly. "What did it feel like when we finished it?" "Like a release," I said slowly, trying to find the right words. "Like part of her was finally free. But not all of her." Elliot's gaze sharpened. "Exactly. She's still fragmented, trapped here in the cracks and corners of this place. The ritual wasn't enough to undo everything. It only broke part of the chain." I frowned, my exhaustion warring with my curiosity. "So what are you saying? That we missed something?" "No," he said, shaking his head. "We didn't miss anything. It's the house, still holding on to her, to pieces of her." His words sent a chill through me. "You think the house is alive?" "Not alive," he said, "but aware. It's been feeding off her pain, her anger, for decades. And now that part of her is gone, it's desperate to hold on to what's left." I shuddered, glancing around at the shadows that clung to the walls like smoke. "So what do we do?" Elliot's expression hardened. his exhaustion momentarily replaced by resolve. We finish what we started. The plan was simple in theory but felt impossible in execution. Elliot believed that the house's energy, the remnants of the hollow-eyed woman's pain, was concentrated in specific places. The carvings we'd uncovered, the symbols etched into the walls and furniture, were more than just markers. They were anchors binding her fragments to the house. We needed to destroy them. I held the notebook in one hand and a crowbar in the other as we retraced our steps through the house. Each symbol we'd uncovered seemed to pulse faintly in the flashlight beam, as though it knew what we intended to do. The first one, carved into the frame of the dining room window, felt almost alive under my fingers. "Here," Elliot said, gesturing toward it. "Start here." I hesitated, the crowbar heavy in my hand. Destroying the symbols felt wrong, like breaking something sacred. But I pushed the thought aside, raising the crowbar and bringing it down hard against the frame. The wood splintered, the symbol breaking apart under the force of the blow. The air shifted immediately, a faint whisper echoing through the room. It was almost like a sigh, relief mixed with sorrow. "One down," Elliot said quietly. "Keep going." We moved through the house, destroying each symbol we'd found. The one on the chair in the parlor, the one beneath the peeling wallpaper upstairs. Each time, the air grew lighter, the house's grip on us loosening ever so slightly. But it wasn't until we reached the final symbol, the one in the attic, that I truly understood the weight of what we were doing. The attic was colder than ever, the shadows deeper and more menacing. The symbol carved into the broken beam seemed to pulse with a faint, malevolent light as we approached. Elliot handed me the crowbar, his expression unreadable. "Finish it," he said. I hesitated, my hand trembling as I gripped the tool. The air was thick with unspoken emotion, the weight of the house's history pressing down on me. And then, with a deep breath, I swung the crowbar. The beam splintered, the symbol shattering into fragments. The attic seemed to shudder, the walls creaking and groaning as though the house itself were crying out. And then, just as suddenly, everything went still. Elliot and I stood there in silence, the oppressive energy finally truly gone. The house felt empty, hollow. Whatever had bound the hollow-eyed woman here was finally broken. We made our way back downstairs, the weight in my chest lifting with each step. The house no longer felt alive. It was just a house now, broken and abandoned, but no longer haunted. Elliot paused at the front door, his hand resting on the warped wood. He glanced back at me, his expression unreadable. "We did it," he said quietly. I nodded, my throat tight. "Yeah, we did." We stepped out into the night, the cool air washing over us like a baptism. The house loomed behind us, its dark windows empty and lifeless. And for the first time since we'd arrived, it felt like it was finally at peace. The night was unnaturally quiet as we left the house behind us, its hollow windows staring after us like vacant eyes. The cool, damp air clung to my skin, but it felt cleaner somehow, lighter. Elliot walked a few paces ahead of me, the remnants of the amulet clutched tightly in his hand, its broken chain glinting faintly in the moonlight. We didn't speak at first, the weight of what we had done hanging between us like an unspoken truth. My mind was a whirlwind of images. The hollow-eyed woman's anguished wail, the shattered symbols, the walls that had seemed ready to close in on us at any moment. It was over, or so I told myself. But the unease in my chest refused to subside. Elliot stopped abruptly, turning to face me. The pallor of his face was stark in the pale light, his exhaustion etched in every line. "We need to destroy this," he said, holding up the fractured amulet. I nodded, my throat too tight to respond. The amulet felt alive, even in its broken state. Its presence buzzed faintly in the air, a lingering echo of the power it had once held. I knew Elliot was right. Whatever connection it had to the house, to her, had to be severed completely. "There's a stream," Elliot said, motioning toward the tree line in the distance. "Running water should do the trick." We walked in silence, the crunch of dead leaves underfoot the only sound in the oppressive stillness. The forest surrounding the plantation was dense and unwelcoming, its twisted branches stretching overhead like skeletal fingers. The path was uneven, and I stumbled more than once, cursing under my breath as Elliot steadied me with a firm hand. Finally, we reached the stream. Its water glimmered faintly in the moonlight, the gentle trickling sound a sharp contrast to the suffocating silence of the house. Elliot knelt by the edge, the amulet resting in his open palm. He stared at it for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "It was never supposed to end like this," he murmured, more to himself than to me. "What do you mean?" I asked, crouching beside him. He shook his head, his jaw tightening. "She wasn't just angry. She was betrayed, used. Whoever performed that ritual, they didn't care about her suffering. They only cared about controlling it." I swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling over me. The hollow-eyed woman had been a victim long before she became a monster, and we had been just another pair of intruders, poking at her wounds and demanding answers. Elliot's hand trembled slightly as he lowered the amulet into the water. The moment it touched the surface, a shiver ran through the stream, the water rippling outward in concentric circles. A faint, almost imperceptible sigh echoed in the air, and then it was gone. The amulet sank to the bottom, its glow extinguished. For a moment the world felt still, peaceful even. Elliot stood, brushing dirt from his knees. "It's done," he said, his voice heavy with finality. But even as he spoke, I felt it, that faint, familiar pressure in my chest. It was weaker now, more distant, but it was there. The house might have released its hold on her, but the echoes of her pain still lingered. As we made our way back to the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The sensation was subtle, a prickling at the base of my neck that refused to fade. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see her shadow slipping through the trees, but there was nothing, just the dark. Elliot seemed to sense my unease. "It's not her," he said quietly. "How do you know?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Because she's free now. Whatever's left, it's just a memory." I wanted to believe him, but doubt gnawed at the edges of my mind. Memories had a way of sticking around, of festering in the corners of forgotten places. And the house, that asterisk house, was far from forgotten. The drive back to town was uneventful, the long, empty road stretching out before us like a ribbon of darkness. Elliot drove in silence, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. I stared out the window, the monotonous rhythm of the tires on the asphalt lulling me into a restless haze. My mind replayed the events of the night over and over, each fragment sharper and more haunting than the last. We didn't speak until we reached the edge of town, the faint glow of streetlights cutting through the gloom. Elliot pulled the car into the lot of a small diner, its neon sign flickering weakly. "You should eat," he said, his voice flat. "You look like hell." I snorted, the sound more bitter than amused. "Thanks. You're not exactly glowing either." He didn't respond, already climbing out of the car and heading toward the diner. I followed, the fluorescent light spilling from the windows casting harsh shadows across the cracked pavement. The inside was warm and quiet, the faint hum of a jukebox in the corner blending with the clatter of dishes from the kitchen. We slid into a booth, the vinyl seats sticky from years of wear. A waitress appeared almost immediately, her expression tired but friendly. She poured us coffee without asking, the steaming mugs a welcome distraction from the weight in my chest. Elliot sipped his coffee in silence, his gaze distant. I watched him carefully, the lines of his face harsher under the diner's fluorescent lights. He looked older, more worn, as though the events of the night had aged him. "Do you think it's really over?" I asked finally, breaking the silence. He didn't answer right away, his fingers drumming lightly against the side of his mug. "I think she's at peace," he said slowly. "But the house." His voice trailed off and he shook his head. "Places like that don't just let go. They linger. They wait." A chill ran down my spine, but I forced myself to nod. "So what happens now?" Elliot looked at me then, his gaze sharp and clear despite his exhaustion. "Now," he said, "we remember, we learn, and we make damn sure no one else ever steps foot in that place again." I nodded, my chest tightening with the weight of his words. The hollow-eyed woman was gone, but her story would remain, etched into the walls of that cursed house like a scar, and it was up to us to make sure her pain didn't claim anyone else. The waitress returned with plates of food we hadn't ordered, eggs, toast, and bacon, the smell comforting in its simplicity. I picked at the meal, my appetite dulled by the lingering heaviness in my chest. Elliot ate mechanically, his movements slow but deliberate. By the time we left the diner, the sky was beginning to lighten, the faint glow of dawn creeping over the horizon. The car was silent as we drove back to the motel, the weight of the night still pressing down on us. I didn't sleep when we got back. Instead, I sat by the window, staring out at the pale morning light. The house was miles away now, but its presence still lingered in the back of my mind, a shadow that refused to fade. Elliot had said she was free, and I believed him. But freedom wasn't the same as peace. And some stories didn't end. They just echoed, waiting to be told again. The hollow-eyed woman was gone, but her memory, her pain would remain. And so would the house, standing silent and empty, a monument to the darkness that had consumed it. For now, though, I was content to sit in the light and remember. After all, some shadows only had power if you let them. And I wasn't about to let this one win.